there, and welcome to the Guns Magazine podcast. I'm your host and the editor of Guns Magazine, Brent. Thanks for joining us here on one of the world's biggest gun talk programs as we chat with the interesting folks who make up the world of shooting. Of course, before we get started, I would ask you, please like and subscribe. I bring that up a lot, but it's really, really important. If you haven't subscribed and clicked the alert and sent us lots of money, that's really important, and we would like you to please take just a second to do that. I'm joined today by my guest, Roy Huntington, the inimitable. You know, I said that 5 times before we recorded.
And I've been called worse than that, by God.
You're inimitable. So today's episode is going to be interesting because as Roy and I were chatting right before I hit play or record, I actually did show notes. You believe that, Roy? Real show notes. That's amazing, isn't it?
Which we've never had those before.
Never do. We literally just sat down. But I figured there's so much information here in this particular one that I know most of this stuff, but I found when I'm staring into a camera and recording, sometimes it kind of goes off and I can't remember my own name. So we are going to talk about from flop to top. I thought that was kind of an interesting idea. Guns that when they were introduced kind of didn't really go anywhere, or actually might have been even kind of talked down and poo-pooed, for instance, Glock. And now they're literally iconic firearms that are extremely popular. Everybody knows them, and they're commercially successful. So there's a bunch that fit that category. And when I was doing my research, Roy, I actually came up with a couple I hadn't even thought about. So anything to say before I dive into this massive list that I've prepared?
Well, you know, so we'll be talking about guns that when they initially were introduced, everyone went, I don't know about that, right? Okay.
Yep. I
would like to also talk about some that died and now have been resurrected.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, let's start at, let's talk about lever gun redemption stories. And the first thing on my list, Winchester 1873. It was, as they say, the gun that won the West, which that was actually the Winchester marketing slogan, and it caught on a lot. But the funny thing is the 1873, it came out in 1873, and in 4440 caliber, it was the first steel receiver lever action. But the funny thing is, it wasn't that popular when it first came out, because what a lot of folks were using, especially say the Buffalo Hunters and things like that, were the single shots in 4570, 4590, some of those things. So, Roy, I think you were back there. You probably took delivery of one of the first 1873s, right?
I did. You know, I was a gun writer back in those days. And then when Winchester said they were going to introduce this silly gun that basically broke open, you know, when you tried to reload it, I said, well, sorry, you know, Oliver Winchester, this isn't going to work, okay? And he tried to tell me that, well, remember, there was the Henry and there was the Yellow Boy, the 66 and all that. Yep. And I said, yeah, but those didn't break the bank either, you know? Yeah. I said, so what do you think? And so he loaned me one. I tested it. You know, it had that puny little 4440 round. Yeah. You know, I had my sharps in 4590, and I just thought, this is never going to work. But against my advice, they went ahead and put it on the market. And of course, I now know what crow tastes like.
Exactly. And you know, it's that was the moment when really it became the repeater became a thing. There was obviously repeaters before that, like you said, the Yellow Boy and all that. But the 1873 was really the one that when it caught fire, it really changed how people looked at a rifle, you know, especially out in the West during the westward expansion. It was suddenly a thing after the 1873. So,
well, you know, most people don't shoot a handgun that well. Mm-hmm. And, you know, and in those days, you know, first that people did shoot two-handed, but generally it was one-handed, right? That was the sort of style. And so I think what they realized right away was guns like the 1873 Winchester, which used the same cartridge as their single-action Colt or whatever, more than likely. It was a better and more accurate way to deliver their ammunition, right? In other words, you you could actually aim and hit something at 50 yards, which you really almost impossible to do, right?
Yeah.
And of course, people being people, they went ahead and they said, well, I wonder if it works on deer. And it did. You shoot a deer with one and they die.
Yeah.
They actually shot buffalo with it, elk.
Yep. Yeah.
I mean, my gosh. And so it was the do-all gun. It was the adjustable wrench of the era, And then I think when other people saw that, they went, we need to do that, Marlin,
Well, and what a perfect segue. And I didn't even coach you on that. That was another one I had on the list, the Marlin 336, which was kind of an update of the Marlin 36. It came out in the 336 came out in 48. And the 36, I'm not sure when it did, but that was another one. It was a poor man's Winchester. And I can remember guys even in my youth saying, well, it's a Marlin and it's not really a Winchester, even though at that point they were still pretty good. It turned out it was the number 2 all-time rifle behind the model Winchester 94 until the AR-15 knocked them both off the pedestal, but it's still very popular. I've got several. I've taken deer and axis deer with them. It's a good gun. It was different, and I think that's maybe what people didn't care for at first. It's like, well, the stuff's coming out the side instead of the top as God intended,
Well, I think, and Marlin has kind of always been this way, at least to me, is Winchester has always been kind of a working man's tool.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a cowboy, you have a Model 94 or a Model 92. You can kind of hit with it. It's okay. It's going to run. You don't take care of it. To me, people who shoot Marlins tend to be more gun oriented. So it's been my experience, the guy who buys a Marlin 336 with a flat top, he likes it because of the technology. He likes it's got a smooth action. He likes the ability to take it apart. He likes the fact that it's flat top so he can put an aperture sight on it, or, God forbid, a scope.
Exactly, like mine are.
Yeah, but I mean, to me, that's how that is. In other words, my working guns, I have 2 here, cut down Model 94s, and they're both are pretty blue worn, and one's got a little light rust on it, and I don't really care, right? But they're tools. Yeah. And I have a 336 that for some reason I take better care of, And I think it's because it feels like more of a real gun or something. I'm sure that there are 94 fanatics out there who are going to fight and want to hunt me down and kill me now. But I think anyone who owns a 336 and shoots it is probably sitting at home nodding their head saying, yep. Mm-hmm.
That is funny. I never thought about that, but you're absolutely right. And that's kind of the way it's been in my experience. So,
and also I think both of those guns, because you're right, when the 336 first came out and its precursor, they were not a Winchester.
Exactly.
And everyone
those are nice,
said,
but they're not a Winchester.
Well, that's not a Winchester. I've got my Winchester, and then it just took them a while before they established that they were good. In those days, gun makers were different because what they would do is I don't think they so much looked at a need in the market and filled it as they went, we would like to make this new design that we have the ability to make, and then people will discover it and buy it.
Yep.
And
build it and they will come.
Yeah. And so I think that was what all of those, the 73, the 94, the 92, the 336 and the precursors there, I think those were all, none of those were in direct response to a need in the marketplace, which is why probably they took, years before they really caught on. But now, gosh, they're, as I hate to say this and you're going to berate me, but it's as iconic as they get.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, now I'm going to get to what really gets your heart all aflutter, Roy, and me too, but Colt Single Action Army. Now, it is literally one of the most ubiquitous handguns, at least visually. If you say cowboy gun, that's what everybody pictures. There have been countless knockoffs and homages, and they're still making it. It was obviously made 1873. All the way through 1940, and then this is hard to imagine, but nobody cared. Nobody wanted one. And about 1956, after the cowboy craze in television and movies, suddenly now people wanted them. And then you got cowboy action shooting. So from 56 to 74 was the second generation. And then again, in the 70s, nobody cared. It was nothing. And then they brought it back in 1978, and it's still in production today. And list price on the Colts are $2,200 for an average gun, and there are countless knockoffs, most of them pretty good. But it's hard to imagine the Colt single action was one of these kind of flops turning into, an archetype. I like to use big words. An archetype of when you're talking about the cowboy, Old West, Western lifestyle, and all that kind of stuff.
Well, interestingly enough, though, when they were first introduced, the old school black powder cap and ball muzzleloader shooters weren't that interested. I mean, Wild Bill Hickok carried 1851 Navies until he got killed, well into the metallic cartridge. And their contention was the same reason why the Hawken rifle was so popular and muzzleloaders were popular, is that if you have ball and shot and powder and a cap, you're in business. But if you don't have any metallic loaded cartridges, you're out of business.
Yeah.
If you're some cowboy out there around the campfire and you just fired your last 40 today, well, then you are now unarmed.
Yeah.
And so it was a long process, actually. And the crossover between the two was kind of decades even.
Yeah.
But then, as we all know, ultimately the metallic cartridge won. But you're right about the Colt. It's like I remember the days when Colt used to go out of business regularly,
Yes.
in the 70s and 80s and 90s and even to the early 2000s. And I used to say, how on earth do you mess up a name like Colt?
Yeah.
Yep. And they did that to that gun, too. In other words, there are people the powers that be there went, well, we're not selling X number of these every year, so we're going to kill them from the inventory, rather than realizing what they had, and marketing it to that. Yeah. So I think people are better at that nowadays.
Agreed. And this one, you will get definitely all aflutter. The Colt Python. The kick against the Python, great gun. Really expensive compared to other things, and it went out of business or out of production. It was brought in 55, went out of production 2005, and then they brought it back in 2020 with some changes. There's some, I think, MEM parts in it now, but I've shot them. A lot of guys have shot them. I know you have, and I know you own a couple, Roy. They're really good guns. So they're still, again, an icon of when you say, a powerful and beautiful double action revolver.
Well, when they were first introduced, because I remember in the early 70s, my commander, I was a reserve police officer in Chula Vista. My commander had a Python, a 6-inch Colt Python. And we were all in a bit of awe by that, because we had Model 10s and, they were $50, $80. You could buy one, Well, in 55, I think a Python costs like $66. I think that's what the MSRP was, which if you do the math, that's about $1,000 today.
Yeah.
So, at the time you could buy a good Smith & Wesson fill in the blank something, for $40 or $50 at most. And so I know there was a lot of people that they lifted their nose at it. I remember even in Guns Magazine in the early issues, it was like there's this and this and this, and there's the Python.
Yes, if you are a Lotus eater, you can have a Python.
That's right. If you're, and everyone talked about the accuracy, and they were essentially hand-built guns.
Right.
And they kind of still are.
Yeah.
Yep. But yeah, you're right. That when they were first introduced, I have a feeling Colt introduced it more. I think there was a passion there at Colt. I think the engineers It was something they wanted to do. I think they wanted to prove they could do this. And they did. And it took a while, but then the buying public, took it on. Yeah, I know it was never like the huge seller for Colt. I think they may have lost money on every gun they made.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the next one on the list is one that the analogy I can use, and I think you'll get this, Roy, is it's kind of what we say about certain musicians that maybe never make it big time mass popularity, but one of the highest accolades you can give him is he's a musician's musician. It's when you talk to superstars, well, who do you listen to? Well, I listen to this guy. And everybody's, oh, wow. The Browning High Power is kind of that way. It's actually out of production currently by Browning. There are many clones. Smith & Wesson's got a great, Springfield Armory's got a great one we have reviewed. But the High Power is that professional's gun that if guys were carrying a 9mm in, especially in the 70s, it was probably going to be a High Power.
Pretty much was. Yeah. I bought my first one in 75 from a fireman, believe it or not. But yeah, it was the only game in town, and it was expensive for the time. I know I paid almost $200 for mine from him.
My.
I know, and it was a typical, little tiny useless sights and a safety that you couldn't find. And
yeah.
I don't know how to say this, but I was always a bit ahead of the curve, with gun stuff. I was always trying to reach forward, and when I got that, I remember I brought it to the police department and I was showing it around. Everyone just thought I was stupid. Well, it's not a 45. Yeah, it's not a 45. And of course, at the time, I think Remington was the only one that had some kind of a soft point load that was terrible. And so I carried it around for a little while, and then I got tired of people making fun of me, so I finally sold it, But in my heart of hearts, though, I realized that, no, this is actually something really good. It just hasn't met its stride yet,
Yeah.
Packmeyer, I think it was, they were early guns. They started to do some sights for them, custom work. Started to do safeties, started to do a little accuracy work, but it was still too soon.
Yeah.
But now, of course, you and I both know it's a significant market. Gerson and the other ones, and they're nice guns. They're good guns. They've got the short officer or detective slide version.
Yeah.
And they really were. I know they struggled at first, and it took a long time. I think it was when the SAS deployed them in the embassy, in the Iranian embassy. That's what suddenly, like the HAMP5, that's when it was suddenly like everybody had to have a high power now.
Exactly. And I just, to circle back, I meant to bring this up, and I kind of got sidetracked as looking at what we're going to talk about. When the Python became really popular? Don't you, Roy? Starsky and Hutch.
Yeah, you're right.
That's when I noticed. I can remember, we had that's back when kids played outdoors, and we played cops and robbers. I remember very clearly, I think it was David, what was his name, that carried that?
Yeah, I know who you mean.
That was Hutch, and then there was Starsky. But one of them had a semi-auto, probably a 39 maybe, but one of them had the Python. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, what a gun, because they made the recoil, of course they're shooting blanks, it's TV, but they made the recoil look like it was just bone wrenching. The gun's coming clear back over their head, and I thought, that's cool. I got to do that.
Well, because they are sexy guns. They're like Clint and the Model 29. They're handsome guns. They're good looking guns. And of course you put the movie take on everything. Someone said one time that in World War I, America had a target rifle, which was the 1903 Springfield. That they took to, the Germans had a hunting rifle in the Mausers, and the British had a battle rifle in the Enfield. And I think a lot of people have used that same analogy for the Python, is that a Python is a target pistol that was also used as a police duty pistol.
Yeah. Yep.
As opposed to a Smith & Wesson Model 10, which was always some sort of a duty gun,
Yeah.
Military, police, security guards, whatever, that you could turn into a target gun if you wanted to.
Yeah.
But I think in the same vein, that also shows some shortcomings because Pythons were kind of fragile, in the early days. They would go out of time. The way the Colt locking system is, when you pull the trigger through double action, at the end of the double action stroke, the hand is still pushing hard against the ratchet, which means then under recoil, it slowly peens, and so where Smith & Wesson, it's not.
Yeah.
That's why Smith & Wesson cylinder will turn a little bit, but a Colt cylinder locks up when you pull it through double action. And so they would get out of time. I remember my commander's Python, we used to shoot PPC shooting all the time. And about once a year, he would send it back to Colt, and they would basically rebuild it and make it time correctly. So
that's a lot of shooting.
Cool. I know. Yeah. We got my dog saying hi. Hi, Cassie. Say hi
Cassie.
To everybody. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, your analogy of rifles in World War II is perfect. It's amazing how you do that, because I wanted to get into military rifles. And this one, people, maybe they'll argue, but they're arguing not history. They're arguing popular perception. The M1 Garand. The military didn't want to use the M1 Garand, and obviously we know that eventually Patton said it was, the world's greatest battle rifle ever. But it kind of had a rocky start from the get-go, that it was too big, too heavy, and that's valid criticism. But it ended up being the rifle that helped us win World War II.
It's true. I think, and it's actually Garand. I know that's hard to believe, but it is. But because it took him like 10 years to finally develop it. And it was a bit of a team effort too, although he drove it. But you're right, because the old school, because you figure this is the late 30s, the officers had been in the military since the teens, right?
Yeah.
So bolt action rifles, some of them were older than that. And so they were confident that all this would do is everyone would spray and pray, and they would not have the precision rifle shooting that we had with the bolt action rifles. And of course we proved them wrong.
Yes, we
Thank
did.
Goodness. Yeah.
Well, the next one is it's going to get people's dander up, because we've discovered AR-15 fanboys don't take criticism at all.
Oh, God.
That's a whole different topic. But no, the AR-15, I can remember, first of all, the early guns did have problems. Well documented. That's where the forward assist came from, which is, kind of a solution in search of the problem. But really, they weren't very well thought of. They were tinker toys and Legos and all that stuff. And they became America's most popular rifles. So it worked out for Eugene Stoner and the Armalite Rifle Corporation, but they weren't well received, because truly they were a whole different take on what guns could be, polymers and aluminum and things like that. And, it really put the world up on its ear when they brought this space gun out.
Yeah, I remember when it was happening, because I was just starting to read gun magazines, and it really was made because they wanted a way to make a more affordable gun in faster, right? Because remember, we were machine steel, walnut, hand fitting. The goal here was to try to get something that literally could be stamped out and assembled fast.
Yeah.
And the cartridge, the 223 was the precursor was a 222 Remington, which was the premier bench rest round. So it had good bones, kind of. But as you say, they chose the wrong powder. They told the boys they'd never had to clean their gun, so I think the platform was okay, but just the ancillary support was wrong. But you're right. I mean, I remember I had one of the very early AR-15s in about 73 or 74. Everyone stared at me, like, what's that? That's weird.
Yeah.
And if I shot it somewhere, everyone would come over and stare at me. I mean, you could see, even at the time, there were AR fanboys that weren't aware they were AR fanboys yet.
Yeah.
So they would come over and they would look and their eyes would glaze over and they're,
Yeah.
But of course, all the old guys that looked like me were like, well, that's stupid. You know?
What kind of sissy boy plastic thing is that?
Yeah, and shoot that little tiny 22 bullet.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was a waste of time. But yeah, we were all wrong about that. It sure came back around.
Yeah.
That was
turned
another
out
time.
all right.
Yeah, it turned out all right after all, so it was pretty funny. There were some other things like short-barreled bolt-action rifles.
Mm-hmm.
I built one in the late 70s out of an old Mauser 98, 16.5-inch barrel, bolt-action, put a peep sight on it. Everyone thought I was insane. Why would you do that? That's stupid. Yeah. It was in 308. And then as time went on, a couple of companies introduced a short bolt-action rifle, which was sneered at across the board.
Yeah.
Everyone said, this is stupid. It'll never go anywhere. People want a 24-inch barrel, and they want a scope.
Yes, and it's got to weigh 19 pounds.
Yeah, and I tried to say, no, this is a police rifle. This should be in the trunk of every police car. Should have a bolt-action short-barrel 308 rifle to solve problems when they're happening. Yep. And then nobody ever listened, so that's fine. And other people were doing the same thing. Jeff Cooper, that's where the Scout rifle came from.
Right.
Jeff and Clint Smith actually was the first one to say a cut-down Model 94 would actually be a pretty darn good patrol rifle, right?
Yeah.
But man, it was never accepted, and nothing, never went anywhere. But gee, do you notice now everybody makes a short-barreled, basically patrol rifle?
Yep.
Yep. And so that was another gun that when it first was announced, people just didn't want to have anything to do with it.
Yeah.
And yet now everyone loves them.
Yeah. Well, the final thing on our list is maybe one of the most controversial. Maybe there's no controversy now, but I can remember because I was there when these started coming out, and that's the fantastic plastic, the birth of the Polymer 9 and the HK VP9 or VP70. I think it was the first. That came out in the late 60s. Glock came out about 12 years later with the Glock 17, and that changed everything. When police agencies started going, oh gosh, we got a gun that's relatively indestructible, even when carried by knuckleheads day in, day out. It was relatively easy to clean. It worked pretty good. And it was less expensive. You could work on it locally by replacing things instead of having to be a master gunsmith. But I can remember the word on the street was, "What are these? It's plastic, for gosh sakes! We don't have plastic in guns." And now look, today they are literally ubiquitous. So your thoughts on the Polymer 9, Roy, that will get somebody worked up?
I'm with you. I lived through it too, and it was really looked down on and sneered at, and again, it was like the real shooters didn't like them. We wanted high powers and SIGs and, but the average schmo cop who got issued, he didn't really care what he got issued, You
could issue him a hammer and okay, that's fine.
They would say, okay. I will say this, and I'll go on record to say, because I lived through it, I had a police equipment distributor in the early 80s. They, Glock got the police market because they gave the guns away.
Yeah.
In other words, they would go to a police department. They would say, we will trade you new Glocks for your duty, usually Smith & Wesson auto pistols. Sometimes they were, of course, still revolvers. So they would just trade out, right? And so Gaston Glock was smart enough to realize that, gee, if I keep doing this, then not only are they going to keep buying guns from me now because that's what they've got, they're going to buy parts and service and maintenance and, and everything else. And then what happened, of course, is other agencies said, gee, why does that agency have these funny black plastic pistols? Then they would look into it, then they would buy them, and so that's what it was. But you're right, boy, when they first came out, it was like my nose was in the air. Why would anyone want that? I remember when Steyr had, they called the GB, I think it was.
Yeah.
And it was this huge, like 18 shot, double action 9mm. That was the first sort of police duty auto that was supposed to be military and duty auto that was supposed to be made for that. And some agencies tried to adopt it. It was too expensive. It didn't work, Yeah. And that put everybody off. And then, but you're right. It really wasn't until Glock came out with that gun that people thought, actually, this one works.
Yeah.
I remember reading Guns Magazine in the early 70s, and they would have roundup of police duty autos, right?
That's a short feature.
Smith 39, Smith 59.
Yeah.
High power, 1911. And they usually would include a Walther P38 too, which sounds funny, but believe it or not, my agency, the San Diego Police Department, used to approve that for duty use.
Yeah.
When we transitioned to autos, and there was one goofball, he actually had a duty holster made for it. He actually carried it on duty. I know.
Wow.
Really? Well.
Well, I've told the story. Part of this is comparison to, like you said, what was available. We were a little late coming to the plastic game on my department, but because we had just invested in Smith 4506, one of the largest guns in captivity. That thing is a freaking boat anchor. And when we were handed these plastic guns, it's like, oh my gosh. And then you saw a Glock 19. It's like, oh, well, this doesn't weigh anything. And they say that it can, it doesn't need to be cleaned and it'll continue to operate. It's like, wow, this is something. So we fully embraced the plastic revolution at our agency at that point.
Well, and you know what, though, you're right, though, because the Glocks all worked generally. Yeah. And that middle 80s Smith & Wesson series, or were they Series 3 autos, I think they called them. I don't remember. Yeah. But they were real problems. Yeah. They've, of course, solved all that. But I remember our first couple of shipments of Smith & Wesson autos in the middle 80s, we had like a 35% rejection rate.
Yeah.
And
that was a problem. And I was an armorer at that point, and one of the reasons we switched was we were doing armor strip once a year on the guns, and we started noticing firing pins were bent. We hadn't had any problems that we had noticed,
you're right.
But it's like bent firing pins, that can't be good. So that's what really started us. Hey, let's take a look at these plastic things. So again, we never had a problem with it, but it just alarmed me and the other armorer. We're taking these guns, we roll them across the table and they go, wronga, wronga, wronga. Right. It's like, that ain't right. That ain't good.
Well, because they had a few times where they jammed forward.
Yeah.
And so that, of course, when you have, a slam fire happens, oopsie.
Yep.
Yeah, it is a weird one, though, that you're right, though. Glock is a classic case of that. I'm trying to think of another one. Actually, you know what another one is? Sig. Yeah. Because I remember when Sig first came over, Browning imported them as a Browning BDA, right? Yeah. Which I think was really just a 226. Yeah. And I remember if you carried that, everyone was like, well, you're kind of weird. Yeah. It was like people who carried Beretta 92s. Yeah. They're always like a certain
kind. You're Euro trash or something.
Yeah. You're like, if you carried a Beretta 92 or a Sig or a Browning BDA, you probably drove an early BMW, and wore suits with skinny lapels, right? Am I right?
We are so stereotyping, but it's accurate. Stereotypes are generally based on fact.
And their backup gun was usually a Steyr something, or the HK MP7 or something like that. They were always like, you guys kind of weird. Of course, they were leading the market a little bit, but I remember I had a BDA. Was that what it was? It was the 45. I think that was the 45. It was a BDA 45, and I had that. Carried it for quite a while. It was a big gun. Didn't weigh a lot, but it was a big gun. But everyone just went like, "Well, that's weird. Why are you carrying it? Look, look, what's that lever for? You lower the hammer after you. Well, that's stupid, right? Yeah. Of course, then once we adopted autos in the mid 80s, it was generally, if you carried an issue gun, which at the time, I'm trying to remember, we had Smith & Wesson's autos of some kind. If you carried an issued gun, you were probably just some cop, right? You didn't really care. You shot your gun twice a year when you qualified. Other than that, you never touched it. Stayed in your holster. The guys who carried the Beretta 92s usually would have slicked back hair, right? Yeah.
We are so peeing off somebody out there.
We are. We'll hear about it. And they would like detail their cars. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Everyone. So it's not a bad thing. It just is. But I found the guys that carried the SIGs tended to be shootists.
Yeah.
You know, in other words, you would see them at the range all the time, burning up their monthly issue ammo. You know, you would see them at the local pistol matches carrying their duty gear. Yeah. Right. Everybody on the SWAT team had SIGs. I mean, they were like the shooter's gun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those in high powers. It was kind of the same thing. Like I said, it was a professional's gun. You know, you ask the rank and file cop, what is it you carry? Well, I carry a Colt and Wesson something.
Yeah.
You know,
Colt and Wesson.
You know, what are you carrying? Well, it's a, BDA is such and designed to, those guys, they knew what they were doing. They knew what they were carrying and they practiced with it.
Usually, and they had good gear, and things were well taken care of, and with extremely rare exceptions. It was really funny, So that was certainly my experience.
I had a sudden thought, and I don't think we've ever talked about this, Roy. When you were talking about when we were carrying the 4506, it has the manual decocking lever, and some say it's a safety. It was not. It was a decocking lever. Some agencies required that you carried your dingus down. And some designs, of course, are spring-loaded, but for the ones that aren't, kids, they had this lever on the back that you push down, and that would drop the hammer, and then you could push it back up, and it was safe. At least that model was safe to carry that way, but that was the admonition that we had never talked about is make sure your dingus is not down. And
yeah, it's true. Or some agencies, though, they made you have the safety on, down, which means that when you drew your gun, you had to find that up on the back of the slide for those people who don't know, and then you had to push that up before you could make the gun work. Yeah. No, that was that was the early days, though. I mean, it was just like the first Colt single action. The guy said, "What do you do? You cock the hammer back
and you carry it that way."
What?
Yeah.
So the old
we
were there.
Officer, your gun is cocked.
Yeah, your gun is cocked. I'm sure. Oh, wait, we have Cassie's back. Let's say hello again. Hello. Hello. All right. Thank you. Thank you, sweetie. Thank you. I'm sure we've missed some guns here. I think if anybody has a favorite gun that wasn't a favorite gun at the beginning, let us know in the comments. I'd love to read them.
Well, a great place to end that. We're out of time anyway. So thanks, Roy, for joining us. Couple of housekeeping things. Well, first of all, if you've made it this far, you're a super fan and you've listened the whole way, I'm going to do something I never do. I'm going to tease next week. It's episode 300. We've got a massive, we've actually got two. We've got one massive announcement and one big announcement. So I should probably say they're both world shattering. One of them's pretty big. One of them's really huge. And the other is pretty significant also. So make sure that you will check out episode 300, which will go up a week from today. So wanted to get that in there. And of course, as always, please like and subscribe. I say it all the time, and there's one or two people out there that haven't yet. So please do that. That's very important for us. And if you're looking to buy a copy of, say, Roy's book, The Insider, or John Connor's Odd Angry Shot, of course, you can go to fmgpubs.com and pick up a copy of those, along with any of our other special interest publications. You can do most of them on Amazon, but I would prefer, personally, if you go to fmgpubs.com. So, well, that's it for this episode of the Guns Magazine podcast. On behalf of everybody that works so hard here at FMG Publications, I am Guns Magazine editor Brent Wheat, reminding you yet again, now get out there and get shooting.